Sometimes the most life-changing moments catch us completely unprepared when we're just trying to survive another day. In 1884 Arizona, Cowboy Colton Graves was dying of thirst when he stumbled upon Aiyana, an Apache woman bathing in the river. Her words cut through the desert silence. "You've seen me undressed. Marry me or we're both dead." Apache law was clear: if her tribe discovered what happened, death would be the only punishment. With warriors already tracking them, these two strangers had to flee into the wilderness together. What started as a desperate bargain for survival would test everything they believed about love, honor, and what it means to truly know another person. But could a marriage born of necessity ever become something real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory, in 1884, was a land where the ancient and the modern collided like storm clouds over the desert mountains. Saguaro cacti stood sentinel against a sky so blue it hurt to look at, while the railroad's iron rails cut through sacred Apache hunting grounds like a scar across the earth. It was a place where a man could lose himself completely, which was exactly what Colton Graves had been trying to do for the past 3 years. At 32, Colton carried himself with the careful posture of someone who had learned to watch every shadow, every movement on the horizon. His frame stretched well over 6 feet, broad-shouldered and lean from years of hard living. The sun had weathered his face to leather, and his dark hair hung longer than military regulation would have allowed a small rebellion he'd permitted himself since leaving the cavalry behind. His hands, large and calloused from ranch work, bore the permanent stains of sun and dirt that marked a man who worked with his back bent under the merciless western sky. He pulled the battered compass from his vest pocket as his horse picked its way down the rocky slope toward the San Pedro River. The brass instrument had belonged to his father, a surveyor who died when Colton was barely 16. The needle spun lazily, no longer pointing true north. Like everything else in Colton's life, it had lost its sense of direction somewhere along the way. The river called to him with the promise of sweet water and shade. His canteen had run dry hours ago, and his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Duchess, snorted her own thirst with every step. They'd been riding since before dawn, pushing hard to reach Tucson before his money ran out completely. 3 days of beans and hardtack had left his stomach gnawing at itself, but water came first. In the desert, it always came first. The cottonwoods along the riverbank offered blessed relief from the hammering sun. Colton dismounted and let Duchess drink her fill while he knelt upstream, cupping the cool water to his mouth. It tasted of minerals and desert sage, clean and sweet after the alkali water they'd found at the last way station. He drank until his belly ached, then filled his canteen and splashed water over his face and neck. That's when he heard the gentle splash of someone bathing around the bend. Colton froze, water dripping from his beard. He should have turned away, mounted Duchess, and ridden on without a word. Common decency demanded it. But something in the way the water moved, the soft sound of someone washing, held him rooted to the spot. Curiosity had always been his weakness. He stepped carefully through the willows, moving with the silent tread he'd learned during his cavalry years. The river curved sharply here, creating a natural pool sheltered by overhanging rocks and dense brush, the perfect bathing spot, private and protected. Except now, it wasn't private at all. The woman in the water was Apache. That much was clear from her long black hair and the distinctive silver jewelry she'd left with her clothes on the bank. She stood waist-deep in the gentle current, water streaming from her hair as she lifted her arms to wring it out. Her skin gleamed copper in the dappled sunlight, and her movements held a natural grace that spoke of someone completely at home in the wild places of the world. Colton knew he should look away, knew he should back out of the brush and pretend he'd never seen anything at all. But for a moment that stretched like honey from a spoon, he found himself unable to move. It had been so long since he'd seen anything beautiful in this harsh country, so long since he'd witnessed someone at peace instead of running from something or someone. The woman turned, perhaps sensing his presence, and their eyes met across 20 feet of river and 3 cultures' worth of misunderstanding. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 26, with intelligent dark eyes that held neither fear nor shame. Her face was oval-shaped with high cheekbones and a mouth that looked like it smiled often, though it wasn't smiling now. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she spoke in clear, unaccented English that surprised him. "You've seen me undressed. Marry me, or we're both dead." The words hit him like a physical blow. Colton stumbled backward, his boot catching on a root. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "There's no time for apologies." She was already moving toward shore, not bothering to cover herself or show embarrassment. "My cousin Nietzsche will be looking for me soon. If he finds that a white man has seen me bathing, Apache law is clear. We both die for the dishonor." Colton turned his back as she reached for her clothes, his face burning. "There's got to be another way. I can just ride out, never say a word to anyone." "You don't understand." Her voice came from right behind him now, dressed and moving with swift efficiency. "Nietzsche has been tracking you for 2 days. He knows you're here. He'll read the signs, your tracks, your scent on the wind, the way your horse disturbed the water downstream. When he sees we were both here, alone." She didn't finish the sentence. Colton slowly turned around. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a long deerskin dress decorated with beadwork and silver conchos, high moccasins that would protect her legs from thorns and rocks. Around her neck hung a small leather pouch that she kept touching, as if drawing strength from whatever it contained. "What's your name?" he asked, though it felt like the least important question in the world right now. "Aiyana. It means eternal blossom." She was braiding her wet hair with swift, practiced movements. "And you are the soldier who used to ride with Captain Morrison's regiment." A chill that had nothing to do with wet clothes ran down Colton's spine. "How do you— We know many things about the soldiers who patrol our lands." Her dark eyes studied his face. "You left the cavalry 3 summers ago. You've been drifting ever since, working cattle ranches, drinking too much, sleeping under the stars because you can't bear to be indoors." Colton's hand instinctively moved toward the gun on his hip, then stopped. This woman wasn't threatening him. She was stating facts with the calm certainty of someone who'd been watching from a distance. "You've been spying on me. My people have been watching all the soldiers, learning their habits, their weaknesses." She finished with her hair and faced him squarely. "But you're different from the others. You never took souvenirs from the dead. You never burned lodges with families still inside. That's why my father might accept you." "Your father, Chief Nalnish of the Chiricahua band." She said it with quiet pride. "And before you ask, yes, he knows I'm here. He knows about you too." Colton felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. This is all planned, somehow. Not planned, but not entirely by chance either. Aiyana moved to the water's edge and filled a small gourd with river water. She drank, then offered it to him. The spirits sometimes arrange meetings that might seem impossible otherwise. He took the gourd, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was warm despite the cool water, and he caught the scent of sage and sweet grass that seemed to surround her like perfume. "You really believe that?" "I believe many things you might not understand." She retrieved the medicine pouch from around her neck and opened it carefully. Inside, Colton glimpsed dried herbs, small stones, and what looked like a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a tiny bear. "This belonged to my grandmother. She was a medicine woman, a keeper of the old ways. She told me I would marry a man from beyond our people, a man who carried great sadness and sought to make amends for past wrongs." "I'm not seeking to make amends for anything," Colton said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't true. Aiyana smiled for the first time, and it transformed her face completely. My grandmother also said I would know him by his lies to himself. In the distance, a horse whinnied, not Duchess, who was still drinking peacefully upstream. Aiyana's head snapped up, her body tensing like a deer scenting wolves. "Nay, Che," she whispered. "He's found our trail." Colton could hear them now, horses moving through the brush, at least 3 riders by the sound of it. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing escape routes and defensive positions. They were trapped against the river with open ground on 3 sides. "The marriage," he said quickly. "How does that work exactly?" "Apache law recognizes intention declared before witnesses. If we say we choose each other, if we make it known, then what happened here becomes part of courtship rather than dishonor." She was already moving toward Duchess, her movements quick but not panicked. "But it has to be real, Colton Graves. You can't take it back once it's done. And if I don't agree..." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Aiyana swung herself onto Duchess with practiced ease, then extended her hand to him. "Then we both die here by the river, and my grandmother's vision dies with us." Colton looked at her outstretched hand, small but strong, marked with the calluses of hard work and skilled craftsmanship. He thought of his father's broken compass, always pointing in the wrong direction. Maybe it was time to stop trying to find his way back to where he'd been and start heading toward where he was meant to go. He took her hand and swung up behind her just as 3 Apache warriors broke through the brush on the far side of the river. The 3 Apache warriors who emerged from the cottonwoods moved with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Colton recognized the leader immediately, Naiche, Aiyana's cousin, whose reputation as a tracker and fighter preceded him throughout the territory. He sat his painted pony with casual authority, dark eyes taking in every detail of the scene before him. "Aiyana," Naiche called in Apache, his voice carrying the weight of family authority and tribal law. "You were not at the water gathering where you promised to be." "I am here, cousin," she replied in the same language, though Colton caught the subtle shift in her posture, respectful but not submissive. "And I am well." Naiche's gaze moved to Colton, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "With this soldier?" "Former soldier," Colton said carefully, his limited Apache rusty from disuse. "I mean no disrespect." "You speak our tongue poorly," Naiche observed, switching to English with the same fluid ease as his cousin. "But you speak it. That is interesting." The other 2 warriors had spread out slightly, not quite flanking them, but positioned to cut off any retreat downstream. Colton felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before violence, the way his body prepared itself for action even when his mind sought peace. It had been 3 years since he'd worn the blue coat, but some habits died hard. "I was watering my horse," Colton said, fighting to keep his voice level. "I didn't know anyone else was here." Naiche's eyes narrowed. "The tracks tell a different story, former soldier. Your horse drank upstream. You came down here on foot." He gestured toward the sheltered pool where Aiyana had been bathing. "To this place." Aiyana touched the medicine pouch at her throat, and when she spoke, her voice carried a formal quality that hadn't been there before. "Naiche, hear me as family. Hear me as daughter of Chief Nalnish. This man and I have spoken together of marriage." The words fell into the desert silence like stones into deep water. One of the other warriors, barely more than a boy, really sucked in a sharp breath. Naiche's face went completely still. "Marriage," he repeated slowly. "To a white soldier." "To a man who has left the soldier's path," Aiyana corrected. "To one who seeks a different way." Colton felt the weight of tradition pressing down on them like the desert heat. He didn't fully understand all the undercurrents flowing between Aiyana and her cousin, but he could sense that they stood balanced on the edge of something that could go very wrong very quickly. "The law is clear," Naiche said finally. "If a man sees a woman of our people in such a state, without proper courtship, without family permission..." "The law is also clear about declared intention," Aiyana interrupted, and Colton heard steel beneath the silk of her voice. "About choice freely given before witnesses." Naiche dismounted slowly, never taking his eyes off Colton. He was shorter than the cowboy, but built like a coiled spring, all lean muscle and predatory grace. "You would choose this man? This rider with the blue coat who has killed our people?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Colton felt his past pressing against his chest, all the raids, all the orders followed without question, all the times he'd told himself he was just doing his duty. His hand moved instinctively toward his saddlebags, where something wrapped in oiled cloth lay hidden beneath his spare clothes. "I would choose him," Aiyana said quietly, "because he carries his ghosts honestly." Naiche's gaze flicked to Colton's hand, still hovering near the saddlebags. "Show me what you reach for, soldier." Colton hesitated. The weight of the wrapped object seemed to burn through the leather of the bags. He'd carried it for 3 years, unable to throw it away, unable to forget what it represented. Now, under the unforgiving desert sun, it felt like the time for hiding was over. He reached into the saddlebags and pulled out the bundle. The oiled cloth fell away to reveal a cavalry saber, its blade stained with old blood that no amount of cleaning had ever quite removed. The brass guard was dented, the leather grip worn smooth by his hand. It was the weapon he'd carried through every engagement, every raid, every moment of violence that had finally driven him from the army. "This is what I was," he said, holding the saber across his palms like an offering. "This is what I did." Naiche studied the weapon with the eye of a warrior who understood such things. "Whose blood? I don't know all their names." Colton's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. A young warrior at Salt Creek, an old man who tried to protect his granddaughter at Canyon Diablo, a woman who... He stopped, unable to finish. "Why do you keep it?" Naiche asked. "To remember. To never forget what I chose to do." Colton met the Apache warrior's eyes. "Some men collect scalps. I collect guilt." One of the other warriors spat into the dust, muttering something in rapid Apache that Colton didn't catch. But Naiche held up a hand for silence, his attention fixed on the blood-stained blade. "My father lost 3 brothers to cavalry sabers," he said quietly. "My sister lost her husband. I myself have felt their bite." He touched a long scar that ran from his collarbone to his elbow. "But I have never seen a soldier who kept his weapon to honor the dead rather than boast of the killing." Aiyana moved closer to Colton, her presence warm against his back. "This is why I choose him, cousin, not despite his past, but because of how he carries it." Naiche was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Finally, he nodded toward the saber. "Put away your ghosts, soldier. We have living concerns now." Colton wrapped the blade again and secured it in his saddlebags, though he could still feel its weight pulling at him. "What concerns?" "Captain Morrison's patrol left Fort Huachuca yesterday morning," Naiche said. 20 men heading north along the San Pedro. They're asking questions about a deserter named Colton Graves. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Colton gripped Duchess's reins tighter, his knuckles going white. "Morrison's still hunting me." "He never stopped," Naiche confirmed. "My scouts say he carries papers signed by the territorial governor. You're to be brought back to face charges of desertion, dereliction of duty, and theft of government property." "I didn't steal anything." "Your horse, your saddle, your weapons." Naiche's expression was almost sympathetic. "In the army's eyes, everything belongs to them, even after you leave." Aiyana turned to face Colton fully, her dark eyes searching his face. "Is this true? Are you truly running from your own people?" "I left," Colton said simply. "I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't follow orders that made no sense. Couldn't keep killing people who were just trying to protect their families." He gestured toward the blood-stained saddlebags. "I thought if I just walked away, it would be over." "Nothing is ever over until you make it over," Aiyana said, echoing something her grandmother might have told her. "The question is what you choose to do now." Naiche remounted his pony, the decision apparently made. If Morrison finds you here, with her, the consequences will be unpleasant. For all of us. So what do you suggest? Colton asked. You spoke of marriage. In Apache law, that creates obligation, protection. Naichi's voice carried the weight of ritual, but it also creates responsibility. A husband must provide for his wife, defend her, honor her people's ways. And if he fails in those responsibilities, Naichi's smile was sharp as a knife blade. Then he dies, slowly. Colton looked at Aiyana, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. 3 hours ago, he'd been a drifting cowboy with nothing to lose but his life. Now he stood on the threshold of something that would change everything if he had the courage to step through. The choice is yours, Aiyana said quietly, both the choice and the consequences. In the distance, carried on the desert wind, came the sound of many horses moving fast. Morrison's patrol, closing in like wolves on a scent trail. Colton made his choice. 3 days into their flight across the Sonoran Desert, Colton learned that survival was a language. Aiyana spoke fluently while he was still stumbling through the alphabet. She rode behind him now, her arms encircling his waist, as Duchess picked her way between towering saguaros and knife-edged ocotillo. The shared water canteen hung between them, its weight shifting with each step, a constant reminder of their mutual dependence. In the desert, water was life, and sharing it was the most intimate act 2 people could perform. There, Aiyana said, pointing over his shoulder toward a cluster of barrel cacti. We can get water from those, but only if we cut correctly. Too high, and the liquid is bitter. Too low, and you hit the root poison. Colton reined in Duchess and dismounted, grateful for any excuse to stretch his legs. The sun was a merciless white eye overhead, bleaching color from the landscape until everything looked like old bone. He'd thought he knew desert country after years of cavalry patrols, but that knowledge had been limited to following established trails between water sources. This was different. This was learning to read the desert's secrets. Show me, he said, pulling his knife from his belt. Aiyana slid down from the saddle with liquid grace, her moccasined feet finding purchase on the rocky ground. She moved to the nearest barrel cactus, her hands hovering over its ridged surface, like a doctor examining a patient. Feel here, she said, guiding his hand to a spot about 2/3 up the plant's height. The flesh should give slightly, like ripe fruit. If it's hard, the water will be too concentrated. If it's soft, the plant is dying. Her hand was warm over his, surprisingly calloused for a woman, but gentle in its guidance. Colton found himself more aware of her touch than the cactus beneath his palm. How do you know all this? My grandmother taught me. She said the desert keeps its gifts for those who listen properly. Aiyana demonstrated the cut, her knife slicing through the tough skin with practiced efficiency. Clear liquid began to seep from the wound, but it also punishes those who take without understanding. They worked together to collect nearly a pint of cactus water, Aiyana showing him how to strain it through cloth to remove the bitter compounds. The liquid tasted strange, slightly sweet, faintly medicinal, but it was clean and would help stretch their supplies. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Colton said as they settled into the shade of a nearby Palo Verde tree. She was the wisest person I ever knew. Aiyana's voice carried the warmth of old love. She could read weather patterns 3 days ahead, knew which plants would cure fever and which would bring visions. But more than that, she understood people. Is she dead these 2 years past? Aiyana touched the medicine pouch at her throat. But I carry her teachings. Sometimes I think I can still hear her voice in the wind. Colton studied her profile as she gazed out across the shimmering desert. There was something eternal about her features, as if she'd been carved from the same stone as the ancient mesas rising in the distance. What would she think of this situation? Of us? Aiyana was quiet for so long that Colton thought she might not answer. Finally she said, "She told me once that the spirits sometimes push people together like stones in a flash flood." At first they collide and scrape against each other, but eventually they either shatter or they polish each other smooth. And which do you think we'll do? Before she could answer, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the desert calm. Colton was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his revolver. Years of military training had taught him to recognize the rhythm of cavalry horses, the steady four-beat gait of animals trained to travel long distances in formation. "Morrison," he breathed. Aiyana was already moving, gathering their water containers with swift efficiency. "How many?" Colton listened carefully, sorting the sounds. 8, maybe 10. Moving fast, but not running their horses. They're confident. Too confident, Aiyana agreed, which means they don't know we're watching. They had perhaps 15 minutes before the patrol reached their position. Colton looked around desperately for cover, but the desert offered little concealment from mounted men. The nearest substantial shelter was a jumble of red rocks about half a mile to the north, but reaching it would mean crossing open ground. "This way," Aiyana said, pointing toward what looked like empty desert to the east. "Trust me." Colton wanted to argue military doctrine said to seek the high ground, find defensible positions, never run blindly across open terrain. But Aiyana was already leading Duchess toward what appeared to be a suicide run across the flats. "Aiyana, that's the entrance to Ghost Canyon," she finished. "Invisible until you're almost on top of it. My people have used it for generations." She was right. What had looked like unbroken desert revealed itself to be an optical illusion as they approached. The canyon mouth was a narrow slash in the earth, hidden by the angle of the rocks and the harsh play of shadows. They descended into blessed coolness, the walls rising around them like the ribs of some massive beast. "How did you know?" Colton asked as they made their way deeper into the canyon. "My brother used to bring me here when we were children." Aiyana's voice echoed strangely off the stone walls. "He said it was our secret place, where we could be safe from anything." "Where is he now?" The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. Colton cursed himself for the thoughtless question, but Aiyana answered anyway. "Killed in a cavalry raid 2 years ago. He was trying to protect the children when the soldiers came to our winter camp." She paused, her hand trailing along the canyon wall. The officer in charge wore captain's bars and had pale eyes, like winter sky. "Morrison." Colton felt the familiar weight of guilt settle over his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd been with that patrol, had followed Morrison's orders to flush out what intelligence claimed was a war party. Instead, they'd found families, women and children and old men trying to survive another hard winter. "I was there," he said quietly. Aiyana stopped walking. "I know." "How long have you known?" "Since the moment I saw your face by the river." She turned to look at him, and her eyes held no anger, only a deep sadness that seemed older than her years. "You were the one who tried to stop the shooting, the one who helped the children escape through the back of the lodge." Colton remembered that day in fragments, Morrison screaming orders, the chaos of gunfire, a young warrior falling as he tried to shield someone behind him, a woman's scream cut short, and through it all, the knowledge that everything had gone wrong, that they were killing innocents. "I couldn't stop it," he said. "I tried, but I couldn't." "You saved 7 children that day," Aiyana interrupted, "including my cousin's daughter." She told us about the tall soldier who pushed her toward the canyon, where she could run. The shared water canteen felt heavier between them now, weighted with more than just physical necessity. They were bound together by water and guilt, by circumstances and choices neither of them had fully controlled. "Is that why you agreed to this marriage?" Colton asked. "Because you think I'm trying to make amends?" Aiyana considered the question as they continued deeper into the canyon, where ancient petroglyphs decorated the walls and the air smelled of sage and old stone. "I agreed," she said finally, "because my grandmother taught me that some debts can only be paid forward, never back." A week into their journey, Colton discovered that Aiyana could create beauty from nothing but raw necessity and ancient knowledge. They'd made camp in a sheltered alcove where the canyon walls curved inward like cupped hands, providing protection from both the wind and prying eyes. Their supplies were running dangerously low. Hardtack and jerky wouldn't last much longer, and they'd been stretching their coffee grounds until the resulting brew barely qualified as brown water. But Aiyana seemed unconcerned. She sat cross-legged on a flat stone, her small weaving tools spread before her like a surgeon's instruments. The bone needles had been carved from deer antlers, polished smooth by generations of use. The sinew thread came from animals she'd hunted herself, prepared according to techniques passed down from her grandmother. "What are you making?" Colton asked, settling beside her with his own evening task, cleaning his revolver for the third time that day. It was nervous habit more than necessity, but the familiar routine of oiling metal and checking the action kept his hands busy while his mind worried at their situation. "Moccasins," Aiyana replied, her fingers working the sinew through holes she'd punched in the soft deerskin. "Yours are falling apart." Colton looked down at his boots, surprised to see she was right. The constant walking over sharp rocks had worn the soles thin, and the leather was cracking along the stress points. He'd been so focused on watching for pursuit that he'd missed the gradual deterioration of his own gear. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Her voice carried a note of gentle reproof. "A wife takes care of her husband's needs, even in a marriage like ours." The word husband still felt strange in relation to himself. They'd spoken the words of commitment before Nietzsche and his warriors, declared their intention to bind their lives together, but the reality of it remained elusive. How could you be married to someone you'd known for a week? How could you build a life with a person whose world was so different from your own? "How long will they take?" he asked, nodding toward the moccasins taking shape in her hands. "Tonight, if I work through the darkness. Tomorrow morning if I sleep." Aiyana glanced up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "I won't sleep much anyway." "You haven't slept well in 3 years," Colton admitted. "Army habits die hard." They worked in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead, the only sounds the whisper of sinew through leather and the distant call of a coyote somewhere in the maze of canyons. Colton found himself stealing glances at Aiyana as she worked, fascinated by the economy of her movements, the way her fingers seemed to know exactly where each stitch belonged. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked eventually. "My grandmother, like everything else." Aiyana held up the emerging moccasin, checking the shape against her mental pattern. She said a woman who couldn't provide for her family's needs would always be dependent on others' charity. Independence was the first gift she gave me. And the second, understanding that everything is connected: the deer who gives its hide, the plant that provides the dye, the hands that shape the final product. Nothing exists alone. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon, not the disciplined rhythm of cavalry this time, but the irregular gait of riders, pushing their mounts hard over rough terrain. Colton tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Apache," Aiyana said, recognizing something in the sound that escaped him. "Moving fast." They doused their fire and pressed themselves against the canyon wall, listening as the riders drew closer. Colton counted at least 5 horses, maybe 6, and the urgency in their movement suggested they weren't just traveling, they were fleeing. The riders appeared at the mouth of their alcove like shadows given substance. In the starlight, Colton could make out war paint and the distinctive cut of Apache riding gear. The lead rider spotted them immediately and raised a rifle, barking something in rapid Apache. Aiyana stepped forward, speaking in the same language, her voice carrying authority despite their vulnerable position. A brief conversation followed, too fast for Colton to follow with his limited vocabulary, but he caught enough to understand that these weren't Nietzsche's men. "They're from Geronimo's band," Aiyana explained quietly. "They've been raiding Mexican settlements across the border. The rurales are hunting them." The Mexican rural police were known for their ruthless efficiency in dealing with Apache raiders. Unlike the American army, they didn't take prisoners or worry about treaties. They killed quickly and moved on. "How far behind?" Colton asked. One of the Apache warriors answered in broken English. "Maybe 1 hour. They have good horses, good guns. We lost 3 men at the last waterhole." Colton found himself studying the warriors' faces in the dim light, seeing exhaustion and desperation rather than the fierce confidence he'd expected. These were men, at the end of their resources, pushed beyond endurance by relentless pursuit. "You could come with us," Aiyana said suddenly. "Strength in numbers." The lead warrior, a scarred man who looked to be in his 40s, shook his head. "We bring death with us, sister. You and your husband have your own troubles. How do you—" Word travels fast among the people. The cavalry searches for a deserter. The Apache debate whether a white man can truly join our families. The warrior's eyes found Colton's. "Some say no. Others remember your actions at the winter camp." Colton felt the weight of reputation settling around him like a cloak. In the white world, he was a deserter and a criminal. In the Apache world, he was something more complex, a killer who'd tried to stop killing, a soldier who'd chosen conscience over orders. "What's your counsel?" Aiyana asked the warrior. "Run fast, run far. The desert is wide, but it's not empty. Too many people hunt too many others for anyone to be truly safe." He gathered his reins, preparing to move on. "But if you find safety, sister, remember that some of us still fight for the old ways." After the warriors disappeared into the canyon's depths, Colton and Aiyana sat in thoughtful silence. The encounter had reminded them both that they weren't the only ones living outside the boundaries of civilized law. "Are you afraid?" Aiyana asked, as she resumed work on the moccasins. Colton considered the question honestly. "Of dying? Not particularly. Of failing you? Every day. Failing me how? I don't know how to be a husband, don't know how to live in your world or help you live in mine." He gestured toward the darkness where the warriors had vanished. "I don't even know if what we're doing is brave or just foolish." Aiyana set down her needlework and moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair and feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "My grandmother told me something once," she said. "She said that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to continue despite the fear. What we're doing may be foolish, but it's not cowardly." She leaned forward and kissed him then, softly, her lips warm and sure against his. It was their first kiss, born not of passion but of comfort and connection. A seal on the bond, they were slowly building stitch by careful stitch. When she pulled back, her eyes searched his face in the starlight. "Besides," she said with a small smile, "my grandmother also told me that the best marriages are partnerships between people who make each other braver than they could be alone." 2 weeks into their flight, they found the ancient ruins. The discovery came at the end of a brutal day crossing exposed desert, when the sun had beaten them down like a blacksmith's hammer, and their water was running critically low. Colton was beginning to think they'd made a fatal miscalculation when Aiyana pointed toward what looked like natural rock formations on a distant mesa. "There," she said, her voice hoarse with thirst. "Those aren't natural." She was right. As they climbed the winding path up the mesa's face, the stone formations resolved into something far more purposeful: walls and foundations, room blocks and ceremonial chambers, all carved from the living rock by hands that had been dust for centuries. "Who built this?" Colton asked, as they made camp in the shelter of a partially collapsed wall. "The Anasazi," Aiyana replied, using the Navajo word for the ancient ones. "My people call them the first builders. They lived here before memory, before the oldest stories." She ran her hand along a wall where petroglyphs had been carved into the stone. "Look." Colton followed her gesture and felt his breath catch in his throat. The ancient drawings depicted scenes of daily life, hunters pursuing deer, women grinding corn, children playing, but there was something else mixed in with the familiar images. Figures that looked distinctly. Apache shared the stone canvas with others that were clearly different, lighter-skinned, wearing different clothing, carrying different tools. They lived together, he said, understanding flooding through him. Different peoples, sharing the same space. For generations, according to the old stories. Aiyana traced one of the petroglyphs with her finger, two figures, one clearly native and one foreign, standing together beneath a symbol that might have been the sun or might have been something else entirely. Until the drought came and the rivers failed. Then they scattered to the winds, but the memory remained. As night fell, they built a small fire in one of the ancient rooms, using wood they'd gathered in the canyon below. The walls seemed to hold the warmth, creating a pocket of comfort in the vast desert night. For the first time in weeks, Colton felt something approaching peace. "This feels like sanctuary," he said, settling back against the ancient stone. "It is," Aiyana confirmed. "Sacred ground. Even enemies don't fight here." They shared their meager dinner in comfortable silence, but Colton could sense something different in Aiyana's mood, a tension that hadn't been there before. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, he asked, "What's troubling you?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me about the winter camp, about my brother." Colton felt his stomach drop. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the reckoning he knew would come eventually. "Aiyana, I need to know," she said, turning to face him. "I need to understand what happened that day." Colton closed his eyes, letting the memories surface, memories he'd tried to bury for 2 years. It was supposed to be a routine patrol. Captain Morrison had received intelligence about a war party gathering in the Dragoon Mountains. We were sent to investigate. But you found families instead. Families trying to survive the winter, maybe 30 people total, mostly women and children and old folks. Colton's hands clenched into fists. Morrison didn't care. He said Indians were Indians, that they were all potential hostiles. "And you believed that?" "I wanted to believe it was more complicated than that," Colton said honestly. "I told myself that orders were orders, that I didn't make policy, that I was just a soldier following commands." Aiyana's dark eyes reflected the firelight, but her expression was unreadable. "What changed your mind?" "Your brother." The words came out rougher than Colton intended. He couldn't have been more than 20, but he stood in front of that lodge like a mountain. Morrison ordered him to move aside, and he just shook his head and said, "Children inside, you go through me first." "That sounds like him," Aiyana said softly. "He always said his job was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves." Morrison didn't hesitate. He gave the order to fire, and Colton stopped, the memory too vivid, too painful. I tried to stop it, grabbed Morrison's arm, told him to wait. But it was too late. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence with its ancient voice. When Aiyana spoke again, her voice was steady but strained. "How did he die?" "Fighting. He took 3 bullets but kept standing until the children were clear. Then Colton swallowed hard. "He looked right at me before he fell, like he was trying to tell me something." "He was," Aiyana said. "He was telling you to remember, to carry the truth of what happened that day." Colton looked up, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "How can you know that?" "Because that's what he would do." "My brother believed that truth was the only weapon that could defeat injustice. Even dying, he would try to plant seeds of truth in the hearts of those who witnessed his death." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared tragedy settling between them like a stone. Finally, Aiyana moved closer to him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I forgive you," she said simply. "You shouldn't," Colton replied. "I was there. I participated. I could have done more to stop it." "Maybe, but you did what you could in the moment you had." Aiyana took his hand in hers, her fingers warm and strong. And you've been carrying the guilt ever since. That has to count for something. Does it? Because I feel like I'm stealing something. I don't deserve your forgiveness, your people's acceptance, this chance at a different life. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, studying the petroglyphs on the wall across from them. Do you see that image there? The one with two figures sharing a burden? Colton followed her gaze to a carving that showed two people carrying what looked like a heavy water jar between them. What about it? My grandmother told me it represented marriage, not just the ceremony or the living together, but the real work of sharing a life. She said the burden wasn't meant to be light, but it was meant to be shared. Aiyana squeezed his hand. We can't change what happened before we found each other, but we can choose what happens next. As if in response to her words, a sound drifted up from the valley below, the distant whinny of horses and the faint jingle of military tack. Morrison's patrol, still hunting, still closing the distance, despite their best efforts to lose them in the maze of canyons and mesas. They're persistent, Colton observed, moving to peer out over the mesa's edge. My cousin warned them you were dangerous, Aiyana said, joining him at the overlook. They probably think you've taken me hostage. Have I? She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since their conversation about her brother began. If you have, it's the strangest hostage situation in the history of the territory. Usually, captives don't mend their captors' clothes. Down in the valley, they could see the flicker of torches moving among the rocks. The patrol was making camp for the night, but they were close, too close for comfort. We'll need to move at first light, Colton said. Or we could stay and fight, Aiyana suggested. This is good ground for a defensive position. Colton considered it. The mesa offered excellent visibility and multiple escape routes, and the ruins would provide cover from rifle fire. But fighting would mean killing, and he'd had enough of killing to last several lifetimes. Running isn't cowardice, he said finally. Sometimes it's wisdom. Aiyana nodded, understanding. Then we run. But we run together, and we run towards something instead of just away from something. What do you mean? She gestured toward the petroglyphs, toward the ancient record of different peoples finding ways to live in harmony. I mean, maybe it's time to stop hiding and start building something new. 3 weeks into their flight, Colton's faith began to crumble like the ancient adobe walls they sheltered behind. They'd pushed hard since leaving the ruins, staying ahead of Morrison's patrol by sheer determination and Aiyana's uncanny ability to find water where none should exist. But the constant running was taking its toll, and now they faced a new threat: Mexican bandits who'd crossed the border looking for easy prey among the scattered settlements of southern Arizona. The abandoned mission where they'd taken shelter bore the scars of Apache raids and Mexican abandonment. Its bell tower stood empty against the darkening sky, and the wooden cross atop the altar had been split by lightning sometime in the distant past. It seemed fitting, somehow, that Colton's crisis of faith should unfold in a place where God himself appeared to have given up. My mother gave me this when I left home, he said, pulling the battered Bible from his saddlebags. The leather cover was cracked and stained, and dried wildflowers fell from between the pages, pressed there by hands that had been dead for 10 years. She said it would keep me safe, guide me toward righteousness. Aiyana looked up from the small fire she was tending, her eyes reflecting the orange flames. And has it? Look at me, Colton said with bitter laughter. Deserter, fugitive, married to a woman I barely know in a ceremony I don't understand. If this is God's plan for my life, he has a twisted sense of humor. Maybe your mother's God and my grandmother's spirits aren't so different, Aiyana suggested gently. Maybe they both want the same thing for us to find our way home. Home. Colton turned the word over in his mouth like something foreign. I haven't had a home since I was 16. The army was supposed to be home, but it turned into a nightmare. Texas was home until my father died and the bank took the ranch. Even this, He gestured between them. "This feels like I'm playing house with someone else's life." Aiyana set down the stick she'd been using to stir the fire and moved to sit beside him on the mission's front step. The desert night was cool, a relief after the furnace heat of the day, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate. "Tell me about your mother," she said. "She was a preacher's daughter from Tennessee, came west with my father when they were newlyweds, full of dreams about building something lasting in a new land." Colton opened the Bible to a page where his mother's handwriting filled the margins, notes about sermons, prayers for her son, observations about faith and doubt. She used to say that God speaks to those who listen with their hearts instead of their heads. "And what did your heart hear?" "Nothing. That's the problem." Colton closed the book, but kept his hand resting on its worn cover. "I used to pray every night when I was a boy. Asked God to make me strong like my father, wise like my mother, brave enough to protect the innocent and defend the helpless. You know what I got instead? A man who tried to stop a massacre, a man who carried his guilt rather than his pride, a man who chose conscience over career." Aiyana's voice was soft but firm. "That sounds like answered prayer to me." Before Colton could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert, not the disciplined rhythm of cavalry this time, but the irregular pace of men who rode hard and cared little for their mount's welfare. He counted at least 8 horses, maybe 10, moving with the purposeful urgency of predators who'd caught a scent. "Banditos," Aiyana whispered, using the Spanish term. "They've been raiding the smaller settlements for weeks." Colton moved to the mission's single window, peering out through a gap in the wooden shutters. In the moonlight, he could see the riders spreading out in a classic encirclement pattern, not the work of common thieves, but men with military training who'd turned their skills to darker purposes. "They know we're here," he said. "Probably saw our fire from miles away." "The horses are in the back courtyard," Aiyana said, already gathering their essential supplies. "If we move now, we won't make it," Colton interrupted. "They've got us surrounded, and Duchess is tired. We'd be run down before we cleared the mission grounds." As if summoned by his words, a voice called out from the darkness, Spanish accented with the rough edge of the borderlands. "You in the mission, we know you're there. Come out peaceful, and maybe we let you live." Colton checked his revolver, confirming the cylinder was loaded. 6 shots against 10 men, poor odds by any calculation. "They're lying. Men like that don't leave witnesses." "Then we fight," Aiyana said simply, producing a knife from somewhere in her clothing. It was a wicked-looking blade, curved and sharp, designed for close work. "You know how to use that." "My brother taught me. He said a warrior who depends only on others for protection isn't really a warrior at all." She tested the knife's balance, her movements fluid and confident. "Besides, I've seen what men like these do to women they capture. I'd rather die fighting." The voice from outside came again, closer now, and edged with impatience. "Last chance, amigos. Come out now, or we come in shooting." Colton found himself thinking of his mother's prayers, of all the nights she'd knelt beside his bed, asking God to watch over her boy. He'd stopped believing those prayers were heard years ago, but now, facing death in an abandoned mission with a woman who'd become more important to him than his own life, he felt something shift inside his chest. "Aiyana," he said, turning to face her. "If we don't make it out of this, we will," she interrupted, "because we're fighting for something now, instead of just running from something." "What are we fighting for?" She smiled then, fierce and beautiful in the firelight. "The chance to plant wildflower seeds in desert soil, the chance to build something that lasts longer than the fear that created it." The first shot shattered the mission's front window, sending wood splinters flying across the room. Colton returned fire immediately, aiming for the muzzle flash in the darkness. A man screamed, and the sound of a body hitting the ground carried clearly in the desert air. "5 left in front," he called to Aiyana, who had positioned herself near the side door. "Maybe more coming around back." "Let them come," she replied, and something in her voice reminded him of her brother standing in front of that lodge, refusing to let evil pass. The battle that followed was brief and vicious. The bandits had expected easy prey, a lone cowboy and his woman, probably carrying a few dollars and maybe some decent horses. Instead, they found themselves facing two people who had learned to fight not for glory or gold, but for the simple right to exist in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. When the gun smoke cleared and the last bandit lay still in the mission courtyard, Colton found Aiyana kneeling beside the altar, her knife bloody but her eyes clear. "Are you hurt?" he asked, checking her for wounds. "No, you." Alive. He looked around at the carnage, feeling the familiar hollow sensation that always followed violence. 10 men dead. For what? A few dollars and some travel supplies? For the same reason armies fight wars and governments make laws, Aiyana said, cleaning her blade on a piece of torn cloth. Because some people believe they have the right to take whatever they want from others. Colton picked up his mother's Bible from where it had fallen during the fight. The pressed wildflowers had scattered across the floor, their dried petals mixing with dust and spent gunpowder. As he knelt to gather them, something his mother had written in the margins caught his eye. "Faith isn't the absence of doubt, it's the choice to trust despite the doubt." "Maybe my mother was right," he said quietly. "About what?" "About listening with your heart instead of your head." He looked at Aiyana, this woman who'd fought beside him with the courage of a seasoned warrior, who'd chosen to trust him, despite every reason to doubt, because my heart tells me that whatever brought us together, chance or fate or answered prayer, it's worth fighting for. Aiyana moved to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "Then we stop running tomorrow. Start building something instead." Outside, the desert wind began to blow, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of new growth in even the most barren places. The riders who emerged from the morning mist weren't bandits or cavalry. They were Apache warriors, led by a man whose presence changed everything. Colton thought he understood about their situation. Chief Nalnish sat his horse with the quiet authority of someone who'd never needed to prove his power to anyone. He was shorter than Colton had expected. But there was something in his weathered face and steady dark eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of leading his people through impossible choices. The eagle feathers in his hair marked his status, but it was the ornate peace pipe hanging from his saddle that caught Colton's attention, a ceremonial object that suggested this wasn't a war party. "Daughter," the chief said in English, his voice carrying the careful formality of diplomacy, "you have led us a fine chase across 3 territories." Aiyana dismounted slowly, her movements showing respect but not submission. "Father, you are far from home." "As are you." Chief Nalnish's gaze moved to Colton, studying him with the intensity of a man reading weather signs. "This is your husband?" "By Apache law and by choice," Aiyana confirmed. "By necessity, I think." The chief's smile was slight but knowing, though the two are not always different things. Colton felt the ground shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. There was something in the exchange between father and daughter that suggested layers of meaning he couldn't penetrate. "Chief Nalnish, I want you to know that I've treated your daughter with all honor." "Peace, soldier." The chief raised his hand. "I know exactly how you have treated my daughter. I have been watching you both for the past 10 days. The words hit Colton like a physical blow. "Watching us? My scouts have been tracking your progress since you left the ancient ruins. Did you think my people were blind to your movements across our traditional lands?" Chief Nalnish dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. "The question is why a man supposedly running for his life would stop to fight Mexican bandits instead of avoiding them entirely." Aiyana's face had gone very still. "You knew about the bandits. I knew they were hunting you, yes. Just as I knew Captain Morrison's patrol was closing from the north and a party of Mexican rurales was approaching from the south. The chief pulled the ceremonial pipe from his saddle and held it with both hands. You were caught between three forces, with nowhere to run except toward the trap I had prepared. Trap! Colton's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped as he realized the futility of the gesture. There were at least 20 warriors surrounding them, all armed and ready. Not for death, Chief Nalnish said, noting the movement. For truth. I needed to know what kind of man my daughter had chosen, whether by accident or design. I don't understand, Aiyana said, though something in her voice suggested she was beginning to. 3 months ago, my scouts brought me word of a former cavalry soldier who was drifting through the territory, working ranches and trying to drink away his memories. They said he carried himself like a warrior, but fought like a man protecting children. They said he bore the mark of having seen too much death and choosing to walk away from it. Chief Nalnish began walking toward the old mission, his movements deliberate and measured. I remembered this soldier from the winter camp raid. I remembered how he tried to stop the killing, how he helped children escape, how he looked upon the dead with grief rather than satisfaction. You've been planning this, Colton said, understanding beginning to dawn. The whole thing. Planning is too strong a word, but when my daughter came to me and said she had seen this soldier in a vision, that her grandmother's spirit had spoken of him in dreams. The chief shrugged. Sometimes a wise leader recognizes when the spirits are moving events toward a conclusion he cannot see. Aiyana's face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. You used me as bait. I gave you a choice, her father corrected gently. You could have refused the vision. You could have stayed with the band instead of going to the river alone. You could have screamed when you saw him instead of speaking of marriage. But you knew I wouldn't. You knew I would. She stopped, the full scope of the manipulation becoming clear. I knew you would follow your heart and your grandmother's teachings. Just as I knew this soldier would choose honor over safety when faced with protecting an innocent woman. Chief Nalnish looked between them with something approaching approval. What I did not know was whether either of you would find the courage to stop running and start building something together. Colton felt betrayed and manipulated, but underneath the anger was something else, a grudging respect for the complexity of the old chief's strategy. And the tribal law about marriage or death, was that real? Real enough, but not as absolute as my daughter made it sound. The chief's eyes held a glint of humor. Apache law allows for many things when circumstances are unusual. So we never had to run, Aiyana said flatly. You had to choose, her father corrected. Running was one choice. Fighting was another. Trusting each other was a third. You have tried all three, and each has taught you something about the other's character. One of the warriors approached and spoke rapidly in Apache. Chief Nalnish nodded and turned back to Colton and Aiyana. Captain Morrison's patrol is 2 hours behind us, he said. 20 men, well armed, and carrying papers from the territorial governor. They have orders to bring you back to face charges of desertion and theft. And you're going to turn me over to them, Colton said. It wasn't a question. That depends on what you choose to do next. The chief pulled a leather scroll from his saddle and handed it to Colton. These are the charges against you. Read them. Colton unrolled the document, his eyes scanning the formal military language. The charges were serious desertion in time of war, theft of government property, failure to obey lawful orders. But it was the last item that made his blood run cold. Conspiracy to provide aid and comfort to hostile Indians, he read aloud. That's treason. They could hang me for that. They could, Chief Nalnish agreed. Unless you were acting under orders from a recognized authority in pursuit of legitimate peace negotiations. What are you talking about? The chief gestured toward the peace pipe, its carved symbols catching the morning light. For 6 months, I have been in secret communication with officials in Washington. They grow tired of the endless cycle of raids and reprisals, tired of the cost in blood and gold. There are those in the government who would prefer to find a peaceful solution to the Apache question. Peace negotiations, Aiyana said, understanding flooding her voice. You want Colton to be your interpreter, your bridge between worlds. A man who has walked in both worlds, who understands both the soldier's duty and the warrior's honor. A man who has already proven he will choose what is right over what is easy. The chief studied Colton's face. But such a man must make the choice freely, without coercion or fear. In the distance, the dust cloud of Morrison's approaching patrol was visible on the horizon. They were running out of time for discussion and contemplation. "What exactly are you offering?" Colton asked. "Partnership. Marriage alliance between our peoples through your union with my daughter. Your knowledge of military tactics and settler psychology in exchange for our protection and acceptance." Chief Nalnish's voice grew formal, taking on the cadence of ceremony. "But understand, if you accept, there is no going back to your old life. You become one of us completely, with all the joys and burdens that entails." Colton looked at Aiyana, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "And if I refuse? Then you face Morrison and his charges alone. My daughter returns to the band, and we all pretend this meeting never happened." "Some choice," Colton muttered. "All choices have consequences," the chief replied. "The question is, which consequences you can live with." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Morrison would be here soon, and with him the moment when all possibilities collapsed into a single, irreversible reality. Colton thought of his mother's Bible, of the wildflower seeds scattered on the mission floor, of Aiyana's hands weaving beauty from necessity in the firelight. He thought of all the running and hiding, all the nights spent looking over his shoulder for ghosts that would never stop pursuing him. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I accept your offer, it means war with my own people. It means I can never go home again." "Home isn't a place you return to," Aiyana said quietly. "It's a place you build with people you choose to love." Chief Nalnish nodded approvingly. "My daughter speaks wisdom. The question remaining is whether you have the courage to listen to it." The dust cloud was closer now, close enough to make out individual riders. Morrison's patrol, bearing down on them with all the inexorable force of law and justice and righteous authority. Colton took a deep breath and made his choice. "I accept," Colton said, the words carrying across the desert morning like a declaration of war. Chief Nalnish nodded gravely and began unpacking the ceremonial items from his saddlebags. The peace pipe came first, its bowl carved from red stone and its stem decorated with eagle feathers and beadwork. Then came a small leather pouch containing sacred herbs, and finally, 2 silver rings that caught the sunlight like promises. "These were made from coins given to me by my grandfather," the chief explained, holding up the rings. "Mexican silver, melted down and reformed. A bridge between old wealth and new purpose." Aiyana stared at the rings as if seeing them for the first time. "You planned even this?" "I hoped for this," her father corrected. "But hoping and planning are different things. You could have chosen differently at any moment." The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything in Colton's experience. There were no churches or ministers, no formal vows recited from memory. Instead, Chief Nalnish spoke in Apache while he lit the sacred herbs, their smoke rising straight up in the still air like prayers made visible. "He's asking the spirits to witness our union," Aiyana translated quietly, "to bless our joining and make it strong against whatever trials may come. And what am I supposed to say? Whatever truth lives in your heart." Colton looked at this woman, who had become so much more than a stranger, thrust into his life by circumstance. In 3 weeks, she had taught him to read the desert's secrets, to find water where none should exist, to see beauty in the harsh landscape of survival. More than that, she had shown him what it meant to fight for something, instead of just running from something. "I choose you," he said, speaking to her but loud enough for all to hear. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. Not because you're my only option, but because you're my best choice. I choose to build a life with you, whatever that looks like, wherever it leads us. Aiyana smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise over the desert mountains. I choose you too, not as my salvation, but as my partner, not to complete me, but to walk beside me as we complete each other. Chief Nalnish slipped the silver rings onto their fingers, speaking words in Apache that needed no translation. Then he raised the peace pipe to the four directions, north, south, east, west, and finally to the sky and earth, binding their union to all the forces that governed the world. "It is done," he said in English. "You are husband and wife by Apache law, by your own declaration, and by the witness of the spirits. What comes next will test the strength of what you have just created." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching cavalry grew louder. Morrison's patrol was less than a mile away now, close enough to make out the blue of their uniforms and the glint of their weapons in the morning sun. 20 men, Chief Nalnish observed, studying the approaching force with a tactician's eye. "Well armed and disciplined, your Captain Morrison has not changed his methods." "He's not my captain anymore," Colton said, but even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of his old life pressing down on him like a physical force. Morrison had been his commanding officer for 4 years, the man who'd shaped him into a soldier, who'd taught him tactics and discipline and the hard calculus of military necessity. "Perhaps not," the chief agreed, "but he still thinks you belong to him. That is why this confrontation was always inevitable." The Apache warriors had taken positions among the rocks and ruins of the old mission, not hiding, but making their presence known. They were outnumbered, but they held the high ground and the advantage of knowing the terrain. It would be a costly fight for Morrison if he chose to make it one. "There might be another way," Colton said, an idea beginning to form. "Morrison's a soldier, but he's not stupid. If we can convince him that taking me back would cause more problems than leaving me here." "You want to negotiate," Chief Nalnish said. "It wasn't a question. I want to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. For both sides." The chief studied his new son-in-law with something approaching approval. Spoken like a man who understands that victory and wisdom are not always the same thing, but Morrison may not be willing to listen to reason. "Then we make him listen," Aiyana said, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. "Whatever it takes." As the cavalry patrol drew closer, Colton could make out individual faces. Morrison rode at the head of the column, his back straight and his eyes fixed on the mission ruins with the intensity of a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. Behind him rode Lieutenant Harrison, a young officer who'd always admired Colton's tactical skills, and Sergeant Mackenzie, a grizzled veteran who'd served with Colton through some of the bloodiest campaigns in the territory. "They know I'm here," Colton observed. "Morrison's too smart to ride into an obvious trap unless he's confident he can win. Or unless he believes the stakes are worth the risk," Chief Nalnish added. "What does this captain want from you badly enough to chase you across 3 territories?" Colton thought about it, remembering Morrison's face the day he'd turned in his resignation. There had been anger there, yes, but also something else, a sense of personal betrayal that went deeper than military disappointment. "He thinks I know something," Colton said slowly, "about the winter camp raid, about what really happened that day. And do you? I know Morrison didn't act alone. I know he had orders from someone higher up the chain of command, someone who wanted that particular band eliminated regardless of whether they were actually hostile." Colton's jaw tightened. "I know there were civilians there, non-combatants who were killed in violation of every rule of warfare we're supposed to follow. Evidence of war crimes," Aiyana said. "Evidence that could end careers, ruin reputations, maybe even bring down some very powerful men in Washington." Colton looked at his new wife, seeing understanding dawn in her eyes. "That's why Morrison can't let me disappear into Apache territory. As long as I'm alive and free, I'm a threat to everyone who was involved in that decision." Chief Nalnish nodded grimly. "Then this is not about justice or military discipline. This is about silencing a witness." The cavalry patrol had reached the bottom of the mesa now, close enough for Morrison's voice to carry clearly in the thin air. "Graves!" I know you're up there. Come down now, and we can settle this like civilized men." "Civilized," Aiyana repeated, her voice carrying a bitter edge. "Like the civilization that killed my brother and called it justice." Colton stood slowly, making himself visible but not vulnerable. "Morrison, you're a long way from Fort Huachuca. What brings you out to the middle of nowhere?" "You know damn well what brings me out here," Morrison called back. "You're a deserter and a thief, and you're going to answer for your crimes." "What crimes would those be, Captain? Refusing to follow illegal orders, walking away from a situation I couldn't stomach anymore. You took government property when you left. Your horse, your weapons, your gear, all of it belongs to the United States Army." Colton almost laughed. "That's what this is about? A tired horse and some worn-out equipment? This is about duty, soldier. About honor and obligation and keeping your word." Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "You took an oath to serve your country, and you broke that oath the day you walked away." "I kept a different oath," Colton replied. "The one about protecting innocent life and upholding justice. Remember that oath, Morrison? The one about not making war on women and children?" The silence that followed stretched taut as a bowstring. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was harder, more dangerous. "I remember following orders from my superiors. I remember doing my duty even when it was unpleasant. That's what separates soldiers from civilians. Graves, the willingness to do what's necessary instead of what's easy." "And what about what's right?" Colton asked. "Does that factor into your calculations at all?" Chief Nalnish had been listening to the exchange with growing understanding. Now he stepped forward, making himself visible to the cavalry patrol below. "Captain Morrison," he called, his voice carrying the formal tones of diplomacy. "I am Chief Nalnish of the Chiricahua Band. The man you seek is now under my protection as a member of my family." Morrison's response was immediate and dismissive. "Indian law has no standing with the United States government, Chief. Mr. Graves is a citizen and a soldier, subject to American justice." "American justice," the chief repeated. "Is that what you call the murder of sleeping children, the burning of lodges with families inside, the taking of scalps as trophies?" "That's enough," Morrison snapped. "I didn't come here to debate politics with a..." "With a what?" Chief Nalnish's voice cut through the air like a blade. "With a savage? A red-skinned devil who doesn't understand civilization?" The tension ratcheted up another notch. Colton could see the Apache warriors shifting position, preparing for what looked increasingly like an inevitable fight. Below, the cavalry troops were checking their weapons and looking to their officer for orders. "Let me go down and talk to him," Colton said. "Man to man, soldier to soldier. Maybe I can make him see reason. He'll arrest you the moment you're within reach," Aiyana protested. "Maybe, but if I don't try, people are going to die here today. Good people on both sides." Colton looked at his new wife, memorizing her face in case this was the last time he saw it. "Some things are worth the risk." Chief Nalnish considered the proposal, weighing costs and benefits with the calculating mind of a leader who'd survived decades of impossible choices. "If you go down there," he said finally, "you go as my son, as a member of my family and my band. Whatever happens to you, happens to all of us. I understand. And if Morrison tries to take you by force, then we fight," Aiyana finished. "All of us, together." Colton kissed his wife then, softly but thoroughly, tasting the salt of unshed tears and the copper of determination on her lips. "Whatever happens," he said, "remember that I chose this, all of it. You, your people, this life. I chose it freely, and I don't regret a moment of it." Then he began walking down the mesa toward whatever waited for him at the bottom. The confrontation at the base of the mesa began like a military inspection and ended like a war. Captain Morrison sat his horse with the rigid posture of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness, his pale eyes fixed on Colton with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. Behind him, 20 cavalry troopers waited in formation, their Spencer carbines held at the ready, but not quite aimed. It was a show of force designed to intimidate without appearing overtly hostile. "Sergeant Graves," Morrison said, using Colton's old rank like a weapon, "you look well for a deserter." "I look like a man who's found his place in the world," Colton replied, stopping just outside arm's reach. "Something I never managed to do in the army. Your place was with your unit, following orders and serving your country." Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. "Instead, you ran off to play house with savages." "That's my wife you're talking about," Colton said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And her people have shown me more honor in 3 weeks than the army showed me in 4 years. Morrison's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Honor? Is that what you call it when they teach you to murder sleeping soldiers and take scalps as trophies?" "I wouldn't know about that," Colton said. "But I do know what the army taught me about murdering sleeping families and burning lodges with children inside." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a grass fire. Morrison's face went very still, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the chill of winter mountains. "Careful, Sergeant. You're walking close to treason with talk like that." "Treason?" Colton almost laughed. "You mean like following illegal orders to massacre non-combatants, like covering up war crimes to protect the careers of ambitious officers?" "I followed orders from my superiors," Morrison said flatly. "Just like I'm following orders now, you're coming back with me to face charges, and that's the end of it. What if I refuse?" Morrison gestured toward his troopers, 20 hard men who'd been seasoned by years of frontier warfare. "Then I arrest you by force. Your new friends up on the mesa can try to stop me if they want, but it won't end well for anyone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of movement echoed from the rocks above. Chief Nalnish appeared at the rim of the mesa, flanked by his warriors. In his hands was the eagle feather headdress, a war bonnet that marked him as a chief preparing for battle. "My son has the right to choose his own path," Chief Nalnish called down. "If you try to take him by force, you will answer to the Chiricahua Apache." Morrison's smile was cold as winter steel. "Threatening a federal officer in the performance of his duties, that's an act of war, Chief." "Then, let it be war," came Aiyana's voice from among the rocks. "We've been fighting your kind of peace for too long already." The situation was deteriorating rapidly, balanced on a knife's edge between talking and killing. Colton could feel the weight of all the choices that had led him to this moment: his decision to leave the army, his choice to stay with Aiyana, his acceptance of Chief Nalnish's offer of adoption into the Apache band. "Morrison," he said, stepping closer to his former commander, "let's you and I settle this between ourselves. Single combat, winner takes all." "Single combat?" Morrison's eyebrows rose. "What is this? The Middle Ages?" "It's a way to end this without a massacre," Colton replied. "You beat me. I come back with you willingly. I beat you. Your patrol rides away and never comes back." Morrison considered the proposal, his tactical mind weighing costs and benefits. A straight fight against 20 Apache warriors would be costly even if he won, and there was no guarantee of victory. But a single combat against one man, even a skilled one like Colton, those were much better odds. "Sabers," Morrison said finally, "like gentlemen." "Agreed." The two men dismounted and began preparing for combat with the ritualistic precision of a military ceremony. Morrison drew his cavalry saber, its blade gleaming in the morning sun, while Colton retrieved his own weapon from his saddlebags, the blood-stained saber he'd carried through every campaign, every raid, every moment of violence that had finally driven him from the army. "Still carrying your ghosts, I see," Morrison observed, noting the stained blade. "That's always been your weakness. Graves too much conscience for a soldier." "Maybe," Colton replied, testing the weapon's balance. "Or maybe it's what kept me human." They circled each other in the small clearing between the mesa and the cavalry formation. Two men who'd once fought side by side, now preparing to fight each other. Morrison moved with the confident grace of someone who'd survived dozens of duels, his blade weaving patterns in the air like deadly calligraphy. Colton was more cautious, remembering his former commander's skill with a blade. Morrison had been the best swordsman in the regiment, quick and precise and utterly ruthless when pressed. But Colton had advantages too: desperation, motivation, and the knowledge that losing meant not just his own death but the destruction of everything he'd come to value. The first clash of steel rang across the desert like a bell tolling. Morrison attacked with textbook precision, his blade seeking the classic killing thrusts that military manuals recommended. Colton defended desperately, giving ground but staying alive, looking for an opening that might not come. "You've gotten slow," Morrison taunted between attacks. "Too much time playing Indian, not enough time practicing real skills." Colton didn't waste breath on replies. He was too busy staying alive, too focused on reading Morrison's patterns and finding a way through his defenses. The captain was good, better than good, but he was also predictable. 4 years of military drilling had made his techniques flawless, but inflexible. The fight moved across the rocky ground like a deadly dance, each man seeking advantage, while the watchers on both sides held their breath. From the mesa above, Colton could hear Aiyana's voice calling encouragement in Apache, words he didn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. Morrison pressed his attack, driving Colton back toward a cluster of boulders that would limit his mobility. It was a tactical mistake born of overconfidence. The captain had forgotten that Colton knew his methods as well as anyone alive. At the crucial moment, instead of retreating further, Colton stepped forward into Morrison's attack, accepting a shallow cut across his ribs in exchange for getting inside his opponent's guard. His pommel struck Morrison's temple with a sound like a hammer hitting wood, and the captain staggered backward, blood streaming from the wound. "First blood to me," Colton said, though he could feel his own blood soaking through his shirt. Morrison wiped the blood from his eyes and smiled, an expression devoid of humor or mercy. "First blood doesn't win wars, Sergeant. It just makes the winner careless." The captain's next attack came with renewed fury, his blade moving in patterns that seemed designed more to punish than to kill quickly. Colton realized with growing horror that Morrison wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to make an example, to show the watching Apache what happened to those who defied the United States Army. Above them, Chief Nalnish held the eagle feather headdress, a war bonnet that would mark Colton as an Apache warrior if he survived this fight. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just a duel between two men. It was a battle between two ways of life, two different visions of what the future could hold. Morrison's blade found its mark, opening a deep gash along Colton's sword arm. Pain flared through his shoulder, and his grip on his saber weakened dangerously. The captain pressed his advantage, raining down blow after blow with the mechanical precision of a man who'd reduced killing to an art form. "Should have stayed with the winning side," Morrison panted as he drove Colton to his knees. "Should have remembered that deserters always pay the price eventually." But as Morrison raised his blade for the killing stroke, Colton heard something that changed everything: Aiyana's voice singing in Apache, a war song that spoke of courage in the face of death, of warriors who fought not for glory, but for the protection of those they loved. The song gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. With a roar that echoed off the mesa walls, Colton surged to his feet, his own blade catching Morrison's descending saber and turning it aside. For a moment, the two men were locked together, their weapons crossed, their faces inches apart. "You never understood," Colton said through gritted teeth. "It was never about winning or losing. It was about choosing what kind of man I wanted to be." He broke the lock and spun away, his blade describing a silver arc that ended with Morrison's sword flying from nerveless fingers. The captain stood defenseless, blood running from a dozen small cuts, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been surprise or respect. "Kill me then," Morrison said, straightening to attention despite his wounds. "Finish what you started." Colton looked at his former commander, this man who'd shaped him into a soldier and then driven him to become something else entirely. The bloodied saber felt heavy in his hand, weighted with all the violence he'd tried to leave behind. "No," he said finally, lowering his weapon. "I'm done killing for other people's causes." Above them, Chief Nalnish began his descent down the mesa trail, carrying the eagle feather headdress that would mark Colton's acceptance into the Apache tribe. The symbol of his transformation from soldier to warrior, from exile to family member. But the fight wasn't over yet. Even as Colton turned away from his defeated opponent, Morrison's hand moved toward the concealed pistol at his belt. The gunshot that echoed across the desert didn't come from Morrison's concealed pistol. Aiyana stood at the edge of the mesa, smoke still rising from the rifle in her hands. 50 feet below, Morrison clutched his shoulder where her bullet had shattered bone and muscle, his hidden weapon lying useless in the dust beside him. "Apache women learn to shoot before they learn to weave," she called down, her voice carrying both warning and promise. "The next shot won't be a warning." Colton looked from his wounded former commander to his wife, feeling something shift in his chest like tectonic plates realigning. This woman had just saved his life with a shot that most trained soldiers couldn't have made, and she'd done it without hesitation or regret. "Stand down, all of you," Morrison shouted to his men, though whether from tactical wisdom or simple shock wasn't clear. "Nobody moves without my direct order." The cavalry troopers looked uncertain, their weapons half raised but not quite aimed. They were good soldiers, but this situation had moved beyond anything their training had prepared them for. Their captain was wounded and effectively defeated, but surrender to Indians went against every instinct they'd been taught. Chief Nalnish reached the bottom of the mesa and approached slowly, the eagle feather headdress held before him like a sacred offering. His weathered face showed no triumph, only the solemn recognition of a moment that would change everything. "You fought with honor," he said to Colton, speaking English so all could understand. "You showed mercy to a defeated enemy and accepted the protection of your new family. By Apache law and custom, you have earned the right to wear the war bonnet of a tribal warrior." He placed the headdress on Colton's head with ceremonial precision, each eagle feather representing a deed of valor or an act of wisdom. The weight of it was surprisingly light, but Colton could feel the symbolic heaviness of what it represented, the final severing of his ties to his old life and the acceptance of a new identity. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Chief Nalnish replied. "This is about choice, about commitment, about the willingness to stand with your people when everything is at stake." Morrison struggled to his feet, his face pale with pain and rage. "This isn't over, Graves. You can play dress-up with the savages all you want, but you're still a deserter and a traitor. The army will never stop hunting you." "Let them hunt," Aiyana said, climbing down from the mesa with the fluid grace of someone born to wild places. "They'll find only Apache warriors defending Apache land." She moved to stand beside Colton, her presence warm and strong against his side. In her hands was her grandmother's medicine pouch, open to reveal the sacred herbs and healing stones within. "You're bleeding," she said, examining the cuts Morrison's blade had left along his ribs and arm. "These need tending before they fester." "I'm fine," Colton protested, though he could feel his strength ebbing with each drop of blood that soaked into the desert sand. "No, you're not." Aiyana's voice carried the authority of someone who knew healing arts passed down through generations. "Sit down and let me work." As she began cleaning his wounds with water and herbs, Chief Nalnish turned his attention to Morrison and the cavalry patrol. The captain was still on his feet, but clearly in no condition to fight, and his men were looking increasingly uncomfortable with their exposed position. "Captain Morrison," the chief said formally, "you came here seeking one man. That man no longer exists. The soldier you knew has died and been reborn as an Apache warrior. Your authority over him has ended." My authority comes from the United States government, Morrison replied through gritted teeth. It doesn't end just because a deserter puts on feathers and paint. Perhaps not, Chief Nalnish acknowledged, but your ability to enforce that authority here, in this place, against these people, that has most certainly ended. The truth of it was visible in the tactical situation. The Apache warriors held the high ground and knew the terrain intimately. Morrison's patrol was outnumbered, outpositioned, and led by a wounded officer. It would be a massacre if fighting resumed, and not in the cavalry's favor. But it was Aiyana who provided the final stroke that ended the confrontation. "Captain Morrison," she said, looking up from her work on Colton's wounds, "do you know what these herbs are?" Morrison squinted at the plants she was using, his military mind automatically cataloguing potential threats. Some kind of Indian medicine. "Sacred datura, desert willow, and creosote bush," Aiyana said, naming each plant as she worked. "My grandmother taught me their uses, how they can heal wounds, ease pain, and prevent infection. She also taught me how they can kill, quickly and quietly, if prepared differently." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Morrison's wound would need medical attention soon, and the nearest army surgeon was days away. But the woman tending to his former subordinate's injuries had the knowledge to either heal or harm, to grant mercy or deliver justice. "You're threatening to poison me," Morrison said flatly. "I'm offering to heal you," Aiyana corrected. "Apache hospitality extends even to enemies who show proper respect. But the choice of how you leave this place as a guest who received aid or as a corpse that received justice, that choice is yours." Chief Nalnish smiled approvingly at his daughter's diplomatic skill. "Wisdom beyond her years," he murmured. "Her grandmother would be proud." Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache warriors who'd shown him more mercy than he'd ever shown their people, a woman offering to heal the wounds she could just as easily have made fatal, and his former subordinate wearing the symbols of a new allegiance. "What are your terms?" he asked finally. "Simple," Chief Nalnish replied. "You and your men ride away and never return. You report that Sergeant Graves died in the desert, his body never recovered. In exchange, my daughter tends your wounds, and you leave here alive. And if I refuse," the chief's smile was sharp as a knife blade, "then you stay here forever, and the desert keeps your bones with all the others who thought they could impose their will on Apache land." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all led to defeat. Finally, he nodded. "Agreed. But this doesn't end here, Chief. The territory's changing, and there's no place left for the old ways." "Perhaps," Chief Nalnish acknowledged, "but today the old ways have won." 1 year later, in a hidden valley where the San Pedro River ran clear and cold between cottonwood groves, Colton Graves, now known among the Apache as Nalnish Yaze, little chief knelt beside his wife in the soft earth of their garden. The cabin they'd built together stood at the valley's heart, its walls a unique blend of Apache and American construction techniques. Adobe bricks formed the foundation, topped with log walls, chinked with desert clay, and roofed with pine shingles cut from trees that grew on the surrounding mountains. It wasn't large, but it was solid and warm, designed to shelter a growing family through the harsh desert winters. Aiyana sat heavily beside him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. She moved more carefully these days, but her eyes still held the same fierce intelligence that had captivated him that first day by the river. "Are you certain they'll grow here?" she asked, watching as Colton pressed the tiny seeds into the prepared soil. "Desert wildflower seeds?" He smiled, remembering the scattered petals from his mother's Bible that had started this tradition. "They're designed to survive in impossible places, just like us." The seeds had come from flowers they'd collected throughout their year, together blooms found in hidden canyons, along mountain streams, in the brief moments of beauty that followed the rare desert rains. Each variety told a story of persistence, of life finding ways to flourish, even in the harshest conditions. "The children will help us plant next year's garden," Aiyana said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who could see the future taking shape around them. "Children, plural?" Colton raised an eyebrow. "You know something I don't?" "I know that happiness multiplies when it's shared," she replied, using one of her grandmother's sayings. "And I know that our children will need brothers and sisters to help them navigate between the two worlds they'll inherit." Those two worlds had begun to merge in ways neither of them had expected. The valley had become a meeting place where Apache families came to trade with Mexican merchants and even some American settlers who were willing to deal honestly with their Indian neighbors. Chief Nalnish's vision of peace negotiations had borne fruit in small but significant ways: agreements for safe passage, treaties for water rights, understanding between peoples who had been enemies for generations. Colton had found his role as an interpreter and mediator both challenging and rewarding. His military background helped him understand the federal government's concerns about security and territorial expansion, while his year among the Apache had taught him to see the world through their eyes. He'd become a bridge between cultures, helping to translate not just languages but entire ways of thinking about land, family, and obligation. "Someone's coming," Aiyana said, her head tilted toward the valley's entrance where a dust cloud was approaching. Colton shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to make out the riders. 3 horses, moving at an easy pace that suggested visitors rather than threats. As they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider and felt his pulse quicken. Lieutenant Harrison, former Lieutenant Harrison, now wearing civilian clothes and riding a horse that definitely hadn't come from army stock. Behind him rode 2 men. Colton didn't recognize, but their bearing suggested military backgrounds despite their current appearance. "Tom Harrison," Colton said as the riders approached the cabin. "Last I heard, you were still wearing lieutenant's bars at Fort Huachuca." Harrison dismounted with a rueful smile. "That was before I started asking uncomfortable questions about Captain Morrison's reports from this area. Turns out, the Army doesn't appreciate officers who develop inconvenient consciences. So you resigned?" "I was encouraged to resign," Harrison corrected. "Something about conduct unbecoming and failure to maintain proper loyalties. Amazing how quickly they turn on you when you start thinking for yourself." The other 2 men had dismounted as well, and Colton could see now that one of them was Sergeant Mackenzie, the grizzled veteran who'd served with both him and Morrison for years. The third was a young Apache man whose face was vaguely familiar. "Mackenzie," Colton said, extending his hand. "Good to see you. Good to see you breathing," the old sergeant replied, gripping Colton's hand firmly. "Morrison told everyone you died in the desert. Big funeral at the fort, empty coffin and everything." "Who's your friend?" Colton asked, nodding toward the Apache rider. "This is Joseph," Harrison said, "Naiche's younger brother. He's been serving as a scout for the territorial government, helping to track down the last of the renegade bands." Joseph stepped forward, speaking in fluent English. "My brother sends greetings to his sister and her husband. He says, to tell you that the old ways and the new ways are learning to dance together, slowly but surely." Aiyana smiled, rising carefully to embrace her cousin. "And what brings you all so far from the settlements?" "Business," Harrison said, pulling a leather portfolio from his saddlebags. "The territorial governor has authorized me to offer certain former military personnel positions with the newly formed Apache Scouts program. Good pay, official recognition, and the chance to help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that lead to massacres." Colton took the papers, scanning the official language that offered him a commission as a special Indian agent, with authority to negotiate disputes and facilitate communication between Apache bands and territorial authorities. "Morrison's influence?" he asked. "Morrison's dead," Mackenzie said bluntly. "Killed in a saloon fight 3 months ago." Turned out he'd been skimming funds meant for Indian treaties, selling information to Mexican slave traders, and generally being the kind of officer who gives the army a bad name. His death cleared the way for a different approach, Harrison added. There are people in Washington who've finally realized that killing Indians is more expensive than making peace with them. Colton looked at the official papers, then at his wife's encouraging smile, then at the garden where wildflower seeds waited to sprout in the spring. What would it mean? He asked. Taking this position? It means legitimacy, Harrison replied. Legal recognition of your marriage, citizenship for your children, protection under territorial law. It means an end to running and hiding. And the catch? No catch. Just the understanding that change comes slowly, and there will always be people on both sides who prefer the old hatreds to new possibilities. Aiyana took his hand, her fingers warm and strong against his. The choice is yours, she said. All our choices have been yours to make. No, Colton corrected gently. They've been ours to make, together. He looked around the valley that had become their sanctuary, thinking of all the seeds they'd planted, literal seeds in the garden, metaphorical seeds in the relationships they'd built between different peoples. Some would flourish, others would fail, but all represented the possibility of growth in seemingly impossible places. We accept, he said finally, but we keep the valley, we keep the cabin, we keep planting seeds and seeing what grows. Joseph smiled, his young face bright with the same hope that had driven his cousin Nietzsche to arrange that first meeting by the river. My grandfather says that the best treaties are planted in soil that belongs to everyone and no one. As the sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Colton and Aiyana stood together beside their garden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, to build bridges between worlds that had been at war for too long. But tonight, they had each other, and they had hope, and they had tiny seeds waiting in the earth for spring to call them into bloom. Are you happy? Aiyana asked, her head resting against his shoulder. I'm home, Colton replied, and for the first time in his adult life, the words were completely true.